Let's make sure we're on the same page here. My understanding of therapy is that you go to therapy to heal your trauma, not to be traumatized by your therapist. Today I got asked this question about therapy trauma, which is somewhat of a clunky phrase. I'm not saying that your therapist is going to re-traumatize you and they're going to be the worst person in the world, but I do have 5 red flags, 5 very important red flags. I'm counting them on my fingers in case you somehow can't count to 5, but here we are in YouTube land. Watch out for these red flags. 1 red flag, pay attention. 2 red flags, probably not looking too good. Any more than 3 red flags, your current therapist or potential future therapist may not be the best fit for you. I'm going to try and answer this question, and once more again, please don't just discard your therapist because they have one of these red flags. I recently made a video on 22 red flags in relationships, and it's just the style of content on YouTube. You're an adult, you can be sophisticated. You don't need to be like, oh yes, okay, they have the red flag, drop them. That's a trauma response in itself. If you're just dropping people because they exhibit any kind of non-perfect humanness, you're the red flag. Sorry to be controversial, but that is just not on. Let's get into the video. Number 1 red flag for you to consider: they never validate your perspective. You're in conversation with them and you're sharing something, maybe you're sharing an issue with your romantic relationship, and they take the side of your partner, or maybe they take the side of your mother. They start saying things like, well, you probably deserved it, or maybe it was coming to you, or maybe it's all your fault. Any variation of that theme. It seems obvious that this is a red flag, that they don't validate you, that they don't mirror your emotions, and they don't seem like they're actually on your side. But you might be shocked that sometimes these dynamics can continue for way too long within the therapeutic environment. It's usually not the major red flag. Red flag number 2 is usually the major red flag that I invite you to pay attention to, but red flag number 1, they don't actually seem to be on your side. They seem to be wrapped up in the stories and trying to work their way through some kind of character defect on their side of trying to criticize and condemn or control you. Just watch out for it. If that's happening way too often, they're always disvalidating you, just reconsider that relationship. But also red flag number 2, the exact opposite. They always validate you. You share an issue with your partner and you're like, oh, you know, they raised their voice at me again, and then your therapist is quick to jump to your side. They are overly validating. They're always agreeing with you, and this is where it gets particularly difficult with mainstream therapists or any therapist which is bound by a legal institution within a certain country. In America, in Europe, maybe in Australia, there are all kinds of regulatory bodies where therapists are literally not allowed to criticize, challenge, or healthfully deconstruct certain narrative or experiential concepts, which is a big problem. It's one of the major reasons that I chose not to go down the traditional therapeutic pathway, because I want to be able to not agree with my client. If they've shared something about why their partner is indeed the worst narcissist ever, or why their parent was indeed the most abusive parent ever, and I feel scared, I feel terrified against the bureaucracy of my country that my license might be revoked if I even dare to challenge their perception, I'm a bad therapist, and that's bad therapy. And unfortunately, there is a lot of this going on. There are many therapists who are too afraid to say the truth, which is, there's 2 sides in every relationship. There are 2 participants in every romance, in every mother-daughter, father-son, father-daughter. Any relationship, any particular relationship you might work through in therapy, you always have your share of the shadow. This isn't to be confused with disvalidating and saying that it's all your fault, but if either of these 2 red flags present early on, you notice a few months in, they're always disagreeing, or they're always overly agreeing, you might be getting an immediate emotional kind of payoff that you feel completely validated and completely mirrored, but it's not going to help you in the long term. It will limit your progress because you're not being given new possibilities and you're not being opened up to new perspectives which an external third party might be able to point out. A really important one to pay attention to. Don't think I need to go into it in any more detail. Either of these 2 red flags, anywhere along the spectrum, most therapists should be pointed Actually, not this way. They shouldn't point towards disvalidation. They should be pointed towards validation, but just make sure that you don't have a cowardly therapist who's unafraid. A cowardly therapist who's afraid to do anything which would be unvalidating. Anything that could possibly upset your feelings. I don't think it's someone that you should respect, because my personal philosophy is if you truly care about someone, you're willing to say things in that moment are uncomfortable, or maybe even lead to a few tears or a heated conversation, because you trust that it's going to support them in the long term. It might be important for your therapist to say, you should really give up that habit and watch out what you're doing over here it's not actually on. Maybe you feel disvalidated. Good. This is something that should be happening within a proportional situation-specific context. And it also leads us through over into the next red flag, which is how can you actually rely on someone to be able to do this in the first place? Red flag number 3, watch out for the intelligence gap. Not just the cognitive intelligence, but the emotional intelligence and the spiritual intelligence, and also for anyone who's artistic, creative intelligence or aesthetic intelligence. I'm not going to go into Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences in this video, but many of my clients, and I mean the vast majority of my clients over the last few years, have come into those first few sessions with me when we're agreeing to do a full month of mentorship, and they have shared that their previous therapist, their previous coach, their previous helper was good. They worked through some things, but I get this variation on this sentence so often. My client will say to me, Jordan, you know what? I just felt like I was smarter than them all the time. I felt like I was moving quicker than them. I felt like they couldn't keep up. I felt like my language was more precise. I felt like I was seeing things they couldn't see. I felt like I was basically, what they're trying to say is, I felt like I was above them. And that might seem incredibly arrogant, but many people who are watching this video are going to be more intelligent than the average person. And if you're going to go into therapeutic space, if you're going to let your heart be revealed and shared with someone, you better bloody well know that they are smart enough and perceptive enough to deal with all of that trauma. It's not just professional skill sets. Someone can be trained in a modality. They can be a somatic therapist, or maybe a cognitive behavioral therapist, or maybe a hypnotherapist, and they can go from step A to B to C all the way to Z. But are they actually smart? Are they actually intelligent? I could never open up some of my most painful wounds with someone who I didn't intellectually respect, but I also need to spiritually respect them and know, for example, that they have an openness towards spiritual ideas before I'd even go into any of my kind of dark night of the soul experiences. You have to make sure that they are not on the wrong side of the intelligence gap. You want someone who's at least on your level, and ideally a little bit beyond you. Someone who may not necessarily be 30 years your senior, but cognitively, emotionally, and spiritually and creatively, aesthetically, all the different intelligences, they are further developed so that you can look up to them and you can relax your boundaries and you can know that they're going to bring new information forwards that was worth the risk of you sharing in the first place. And I've had so many of my clients, almost every client that's worked with a previous therapist, it comes to this moment where they say, yep, I got everything I needed from the therapist. It was a wonderful working relationship, but I felt that with this particular issue related to my dark night of the soul, or my professional ambitions, or my certain psychic complexity around a certain shadow part, they just didn't get it. They just didn't get it. And that's fine. But it's a real problem. We often talk about how we need to give more support to people who need a bit of a slower pace, and people who need that extra time, maybe people who have difficulties in one way or another. Very rarely do we have a conversation about how to support people who are more developed and more advanced, and it's not to be taken into arrogance. These conversations I have behind the scenes are because they see me as someone who's on their level, someone who can give new insights because they respect my intelligence in one way or another, and I love that I have that and I can offer that to that kind of person. But it's so unfortunate that this conversation is just not focused on. It's one of those major red flags that I know I could never pass through if I didn't. If I'd seen it, I just wouldn't be able to work with that kind of therapist. It wouldn't work for me, and usually it takes a few weeks or months to realize this, but just cut your losses early in a conscious, conversational way. Don't just leave. But if you know You already know. Let's move on to the fourth red flag, which is a really important red flag, which again is one of the reasons why I haven't done mainstream therapeutic accreditation, and that is the lack of conversation about how to end therapy and the goals and timelines for the future ahead. I've chosen to do 4-month mentorships, which is a time-limited therapeutic container mixing between academic, self-development, and therapeutic, and I really like that because from session 1 to session 12 over a 4-month period, myself and the client both understand the timeline of time-restricted support. And it works really well because you haven't got an infinitely stretched out road of endless therapeutic potential, which means that the therapy can go on for too long, you can spend too much money, too much time, and you're actually slowing down your own healing process. If your therapist has never had a conversation with you about how to transition out of therapy, how to end the therapy, what kind of things would you want to feel on the inside, what kind of situations would you like in your life to feel comfortable to start to consider uncoupling from this therapeutic relationship, it might be an indication that they're treating you as a bit of a cash cow to get money from you, or otherwise be in a dynamic where they just don't understand the importance of actually finishing a therapeutic situation. It's not just about beginning, it's about the ending. We're not good with breakups. We're not good with actually closing the chapter, and therapists are still humans, and even many therapists I've seen online, they like these multi-year timelines because they really get to know a patient. They get to understand the intricacies of their psyche, and some would say, well, that means that therapy goes deeper, and if you spend 3 years doing therapy, you get to really understand someone and go into all the shadow complexities in a very nuanced way that naturally require that much time. Potentially, but I would verge towards the opposite opinion, which is if they're completely avoidant of any kind of conversation around where are the goals, where are the outcomes, where are the tangible actions that would indicate that you have healed some of your mental health and you've worked through the presenting issues that you came into therapy with in the first place. Just watch out for it. That's another one of those major red flags. For example, if you had this red flag number 4, and the previous red flag of the intelligence gap, both of them together, they can't even see you clearly, and they're not prepared for the conversation of who you are outside of the therapeutic container. Just watch out for it. Just watch out for it. Let's wrap this up with the final red flag number 5, and this should be obvious. This should be obvious. I wish this was obvious, but people don't pay attention to this. Look for their character. Look at their actual life and make sure that you know, do my values line up with their values, and do they seem like someone who's actually got the integrity behind their own values? If you're going to a therapist for relationship counseling and they've never had one successful long-term relationship for multiple years, or you're going to a therapist to heal some kind of trauma around childhood abandonment and they don't understand what that feels like because they've experienced no trauma, or even worse, they've experienced lots of trauma, but you can tell that they're still in kind of an anxious nervous system dysregulation. They start talking like this whenever you bring up the therapy. You're in therapy. Let's make it real. You're in therapy, you bring up that a horrific abuse happened in childhood, and they're normally talking like this. They're saying, yes, please tell me some more. Oh no, I'm so sorry about that. But you bring up that abuse, and then they start speaking really quickly, and they're saying, okay, well, how about it? And you've seen that they're getting agitated. They haven't healed their actual trauma. You're triggering a counter-transference in them, and they're not safe enough to support you. They're not the real deal. I recently released a video about how to spot winner friends versus loser friends, which is basically a shorthand, more clickbaity way of saying good people and bad people, or high conscious people and low vibration people. And the core invitation for that video is look at their body and listen to their language. The exact same principle applies on this red flag. If your therapist is significantly obese or significantly malnourished, if their skin looks flat and dead and their eyes are kind of distant and soulless and they don't seem present, if their posture is all slumped over, or maybe they're really rigid and they don't actually have the ability to flow, these are really strong signs that they're not a healthy person. Same with their language. If you notice that they're gossiping, if you notice that they get a kick out of negativity, if you notice that their life seems to be falling apart in a major way, beyond the normal human complexities that we all deal with, I know that as a facilitator, I am not perfect. I go through my own struggles. I go through my own stresses. There is the very odd moment where I'll have a session maybe a handful of times per year, and a client will say to me, Jordan, how is your day going? Normal small talk, first few minutes of a session. How's your day going? And I'll say quite honestly, rather than lying, you know what? Actually, I'm a bit stressed today and I had to go for an extra long walk before the session because something's happening with business, and I appreciate you asking, but you know what it's like. If I'm a bit distracted for the first few minutes, I apologize. I'm going to be present with you in just a moment. And then they say, oh, I'm so sorry. And maybe the conversation's a few more minutes than normal for the small talk, and I didn't perfectly pre-process all my emotions like I normally would. But because it's a human-to-human connection, and I understand that my client understands that I'm a human, if I have a few minutes of being slightly distracted, I've pre-established that they can call me out on it. They can say, hey, you seem distracted, what's going on here? They can say, hey, you seem stressed, what's going on here? My client treats me as a human rather than a pedestalized distant figure, and often trauma can block our perception that not only do we not need to pedestalize someone, but we can't even see the reality that's in front of us. Are they out of shape in an extremely obvious way? Is their skin, their eyes, are they clearly unhealthy? And how's their language? Be human. Your therapist is a person. Whoever you're working with as a coach or facilitator, they're a human. They're not going to show up perfectly, especially if you're working with someone for many months. You're likely to see them in a moment where they've got a little bit less energy available. But if you've already noticed a pattern where they're low energy, their life is in shambles, and they don't seem to have successful relationships, they don't seem to be fulfilled in work, and they're clearly not there in their fitness, their sobriety, their healthy lifestyle habits, is this really a person that you want to give yourself over to in those most vulnerable moments and ask them to show up for you in courage and with clarity if their own life is in shambles? I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't trust someone like that. For me personally, these 5 red flags altogether, they really do form a solid foundation to prevent any of this therapy trauma that unfortunately people go through. Rapid recap. Number 1, they always disvalidate you. Number 2, they never seem to actually disvalidate you in the first place. They're either always disagreeing or always agreeing. Both of them together, really bad situations. Number 3, we have the intelligence gap. Number 4, we have, I'm looking at the post-it note here, we have that inability to look at outcomes and goals and the ending of therapy. And the final red flag, just watch out for their character. Look at them. Watch them a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, it's about you. It should be mostly you talking in a session. For a good therapeutic session, you'd want at least an 80-20 split. Occasionally, it's like 60%, 40%. You're primarily the one talking. Maybe for a certain session, it would be more conversational. But if you notice that the things that they share just don't align with your value system, they're probably not someone that you can trust. It doesn't need to be complex just because they've got a diploma on the wall and they've got many decades of experience. You still need to work with someone who's someone you'd actually respect and like being around, and you enjoy their example of what they've done with their life, because I just don't think you can bypass that. Otherwise, you're treating therapy as if it's a somewhat medical model where there's a solution, there's a fix, there's a pill, there's a process, there's a surgery, but it's a human-to-human, heart-based relationship. Good therapy includes the heart, the mind, and the soul. If you've got someone who seems to be overly intellectualized or maybe even too heart-based without the intelligence to back themselves up, or they're just really super spiritual and they don't seem to understand trauma at all, just watch out for these things. I hope this video has been useful. If you have any more particular trauma therapy moments, maybe don't trauma dump them in the comments section, but do give me some questions if you're looking for specific repairs within the therapeutic environment, because this is a massive issue. I've got major problems with how therapy is being conducted in the major countries of the world that I'm aware of, and that's why I haven't done it personally. I don't like the constrictions, I don't like the rules and regulations, and don't like how bad therapists can continue in practice for many years just because they updated their therapeutic skill set by doing a 20-hour diploma every year or randomly. It's just major issues. These are 5 red flags to look out for. I hope they've been useful, and I'll see you in the next video. It's right over here. We're going to be talking about more trauma and therapeutic solutions, and hopefully I won't show up with any of those red flags. But if I do, I guess you leave.